I don't think there's, unfortunately, a good or easy silver bullet solution to this. It's a really intractable problem. As long as the Houthis think that they're winning their messaging war, then they will likely at least want to continue.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. On July 19th, the Houthis launched a drone that struck an apartment building in Tel Aviv, killing an Israeli. This was a long-range, sophisticated drone and was the first time that the Houthis successfully struck Israeli soil. Israel responded with airstrikes against the Port of Hodeida in the Houthi-controlled part of Yemen. The Houthis are the de facto rulers of most of Yemen, including the capital Sanaa and the main port city, Hodeida. About a month into the Gaza war, the Houthis, which are part of the so-called Axis of Resistance that includes Hamas and Hezbollah, began attacking civilian commercial vessels in the Red Sea. The U.S. has led an international mission to protect those ships in the Red Sea and deter Houthi attacks by striking targets in Yemen. At the time, many Yemen experts, including my guest today, Alex Stark, warned that bombing the Houthis would not deter them and likely only embolden the group. This escalation against Israel proved her right. Alex Stark is an associate policy researcher at RAND who wrote a prescient article in Foreign Affairs some months ago titled "Don't Bomb the Houthis." In our conversation, Alex Stark explains why this attack on Israel was such an escalation, offers some broader context in which the Houthis decided to launch their Red Sea attacks, and gives some perspective on how this latest escalation may evolve. So Alex Stark is a longtime listener of Global Dispatches. I always love it when listeners come on to be the guests on the show. It really is a good demonstration of the amazing community that we've built around this show and, frankly, the kind of impactful audience that this show reaches. Also, Alex tells me that she is a big fan of our newest show, To Save Us From Hell, our weekly podcast about the United Nations. If you haven't already done so, do check that out. And lastly, I would so appreciate your support. We do depend on a degree of listener support to keep this show going. Please visit globaldispatches.org and purchase a subscription to help us keep the lights on around here. We really appreciate it, and I'll post a link to the show notes of this episode. Now here is my conversation with Alex Stark of the RAND Corporation. So, Alex, can I have you describe what do we know about this Houthi drone attack that struck Tel Aviv on July 19th?
Yeah, so on July 19th, as you said, the Houthis launched a drone attack in Tel Aviv in Israel that killed one person and injured at least 10 more. It was an unprecedented strike in a few different ways because the Houthis have launched over 200 drones and missiles towards Israel since last October. But as far as we know, this is the first one to really cause damage and certainly the first to kill an Israeli citizen. It's also unprecedented because the drone that the Houthis used is a similar model to the one that they've used in past attacks on Saudi Arabia and the UAE and other places. But in this instance, it traveled several hundred miles further than its known existing range. And it was also very unusual that it was able to pass through Israel's advanced air defense systems. So in response, Israel launched airstrikes on Hodeida port, which is the largest commercial port in Houthi territory. The attack struck oil storage facilities and other types of trade infrastructure at the port. And according to the Houthis, the strikes killed 6 people and injured another 83. And Israeli officials said that they had targeted Hodeida specifically because it's a site for weapons smuggling between Iran and the Houthis. So that's kind of the latest in that particular escalatory engagement as we're speaking. But I think we might see more in the future between the Houthis and Israel.
Yeah, and it really is my intention with this conversation to give listeners kind of context they need to understand this escalating cycle of violence between the Houthis and Israel as this unfolds, as it almost certainly will. But, one thing I think it's like worth emphasizing is just like the sheer distances involved. I mean, Houthi-controlled Yemen and Israel, they're not close to each other. And yet you saw the ability of the Houthis to launch this attack. And then the Israeli reprisal attack on Hodeida that required fighter jets traveling very long distances, doing like midair refueling. This was like a long distance strike.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I think this strike was further than experts had anticipated that this kind of Houthi drone could travel. And it's certainly one of the furthest they've done, and illustrates, like you said, the escalating cycle of violence and attacks between the Houthis on one hand and Israel, and also separately on the United States and a coalition in the Red Sea.
So I wanted to discuss like the broader context in which this attack occurred, which is the Houthis' ongoing attacks on commercial ships in the Red Sea and a U.S.-led coalition intended to deter those attacks. Can you just bring us back to the beginning of this story and explain why the Houthis have begun attacking ships in the Red Sea and what the U.S. and international response has been?
This latest strike, I think, was an escalation in a lot of ways, but it's also, as you said, part of an ongoing cycle of military attacks that have been launched by the Houthis, both in the Red Sea and also attempted strikes on Israel. So since about November 2023, the Houthis have targeted dozens of ships at this point in the Red Sea. Originally, they were targeting commercial ships, and they early on hijacked one ship. They've sunk 2 others in attacks. And in one of those, the attack on a ship called the True Confidence actually ended up killing 4 sailors. And they have since expanded their attacks to focus on the U.S.-led coalition that's operating in the Red Sea as well. The Houthis have used ballistic and cruise missiles. They've used drones and even small boats that are packed with explosives that are known as uncrewed surface vessels, or USVs. And sometimes they've used 2 or a combination of 2 or all 3 of these things in their attacks on commercial vessels in the Red Sea. So in response, since January 2024, a U.S.-led international coalition that's called Operation Prosperity Guardian has been trying to protect commercial ships in the Red Sea. It's been shooting down Houthi missiles and drones. And also on several occasions, the U.S., and sometimes working with the U.K., has targeted Houthi military assets on land. As CENTCOM has reported, they've targeted missiles that are about to launch, for example, and also military infrastructure that's related to the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea. And in retaliation, as I mentioned, the Houthis have announced that they had expanded the scope of their own attacks to include military ships as well as commercial vessels, although fortunately, they have not succeeded in striking a military vessel, although unfortunately, they have hit a few commercial ships.
How has commercial shipping through the Red Sea been impacted by these attacks over the last few months?
The Red Sea is an important throughway for ships that are passing through the Suez Canal. So it's an important site for global trade. About 10% or so of global trade passes through the Red Sea, or at least it used to. The geography of the region basically means that there is a narrow strait between the tip of Yemen and the Horn of Africa that's called the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, and that really creates kind of a geographic choke point for international trade. So as the Houthi attacks have continued, we've seen some commercial ships are still attempting to transit the Red Sea, but traffic through the Red Sea has also declined significantly in this year. Many ships are now taking an alternate route that goes kind of around the Cape of Good Hope around South Africa, which is a much longer trip and therefore a more expensive one. And so, in addition to delays in international shipping, the higher insurance premiums, and other related costs, this has all driven up the cost of global trade. And that in turn often leads to higher prices for consumers. Another interesting thing, I just saw a Bloomberg story that found that the Houthis have attacked more merchant ships carrying Russian products from any other country, but we've seen that they've really impacted a wide range of countries and kinds of commercial trade.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't appear that the Houthis discriminate in any ways on the kind of ships that they are attacking, that it seems like very opportunistic. If they can attack a commercial ship, they will, no matter like where it's flagged.
It's weird because they have said publicly that they're specifically trying to target Israeli ships or ships owned by the US. But, I think as that story really illustrates, the whole concept of like what even is an Israeli ship or a US ship is a bit murky, because these ships might be owned by, a multinational corporation that's based in one country, and then they might be flagged under another country. And then they have crews that are often from, a few different countries around the world. And then on top of that, they're transiting goods from one country to another. The multinational nature of how global trade and how these ships works makes it difficult to kind of discern what exactly is meant by that. But even so, I think we can say that the Houthis have not limited themselves in practice to only targeting Israeli or US ships.
So, as the Houthis began their attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea, as you noted, the response by the United States and other international partners was to move naval assets into the Red Sea to defend commercial shipping and also proactively bomb and attack Yemen and Houthi targets in Yemen. There was this near unanimous consensus among the very few Yemen experts that exist out there in Washington, you among them, arguing that bombing the Houthis is the wrong approach here, and it won't have the intended results. It won't deter future attacks. And your arguments proved to be correct. It did not deter these attacks. These attacks have accelerated, in fact. Why is it the wrong strategy to militarily attack the Houthis in this manner, and why has it not deterred attacks by Houthis against commercial shipping in the Red Sea?
So to be fair, I think it's a really difficult policy problem, and it's something that does need to be addressed. As we've discussed, it has had, substantial economic impacts on international trade. And I don't think anyone has particular sympathy for the Houthis either. They're a violent, repressive, autocratic regime. But I think we're already seeing that the tools that the US and its partners have tried to use, including trying to protect ships in the Red Sea, attacking Houthi targets, as well as a terrorist designation, some economic sanctions on individuals related to Houthi finance. And all of that has not deterred the Houthi attacks. So I think the problem is essentially that the Houthis believe they're winning. They have used the attacks to spread messages that they perceive as very beneficial to them, to bolster their legitimacy within Yemen, because they have very little legitimacy, frankly, that entitles them to rule otherwise. They certainly haven't won any elections. Again, they're violently oppressive and brutal towards their own people. But this is a kind of rally around the flag effect that they can take advantage of, that they see as quite useful, I think. And it's for a cause that's popular within Yemen and across the region more broadly, that the Houthis are really trying to paint these attacks as in defense of the people of Palestine. I think the attacks have also been a useful signal for them to show that they're an important member of Iran's axis of resistance, and to continue to build their relationship with Iran and with other members of the axis. They have even already claimed to be coordinating with another group in Iraq called the Islamic Resistance in Iraq. So I think that as long as the Houthis believe they are winning this messaging campaign, then their Red Sea strikes will be likely to continue.
So, I mean, based on what you're describing, the attacks on the Houthis by the U.S.-led coalition and now by Israel served only to strengthen the Houthis' position domestically in Yemen.
Yeah, it's hard to know for sure without systematic polling, but I think that's right, or at least I think the Houthis believe that that is the case. The strikes have likely eroded their military capabilities, but I think they see that as a relatively low cost to pay for a message that's ultimately very beneficial to them, especially domestically in terms of shoring up their own legitimacy, but abroad as well.
I mean, so absent like a ceasefire in Gaza, is there anything that at this point might deter or prevent the Houthis from continuing their attacks on commercial ships in the Red Sea? These are war crimes, right? These are attacks against like civilian vessels committed by an armed group. Like, this is not good, and it ought to stop.
No, yeah, it's not good from a range of perspectives. It's against international law. It's attacks on civilians. There's civilians who are operating these commercial vessels. It's had these negative economic impacts, as we've discussed, and it can only be making life harder, I think, for average people in Yemen as it drives up the costs of basic food and fuel and goods for people who are already living in a pretty catastrophic humanitarian situation. So I don't think there's, unfortunately, a good or easy silver bullet solution to this. It's a really intractable problem. As long as the Houthis think that they're winning their messaging war, then they will likely at least want to continue their strikes. And even if the U.S. is able to erode their capabilities, take out their missile sites, for example, the Houthis have shown that they are pretty versatile at using especially lower cost, lower tech means of launching these attacks as well. I think one way to deter them will be ultimately figuring out a sustainable ceasefire agreement in Gaza, ideally even a path towards a more substantial peace agreement in Gaza. I don't think that a Gaza ceasefire will guarantee that the Houthi attacks will stop. I think now that the Houthis have discovered the source of leverage that's very useful for them, it's going to be very hard to stop them. But I do think that a Gaza ceasefire would take away kind of the line that they've been using to justify these attacks and to build their own legitimacy. So it might kind of erode the reason behind them. And then another point of diplomatic leverage is the Houthis' relationship with Russia and China. So reportedly, the Houthis gave assurances to both of those countries that they wouldn't target Russian or Chinese ships. But, as we've discussed in practice, they have. And this has no doubt had substantial impacts on Russian and Chinese trade. And I have to imagine is a concern for Russia and China. And in fact, both Russia and China, I think, abstained from the UN Security Council votes that condemned the Houthi attacks. So they didn't veto those resolutions, which is interesting. So I think there may be some space to use that diplomatic leverage to convince the Houthis potentially to stop their attacks as well.
That's interesting. I'd not heard that before, but that does seem like one potential opportunity out there. Another kind of point of leverage that you often hear discussed, particularly in recent days, is to designate the Houthis as a terrorist organization. Now, in the tail end of the Trump administration, the Houthis were designated a terrorist organization, and then the Biden administration undesignated them. And the Biden administration did so under pressure or because of the advocacy by humanitarian groups. Yemen is or was one of the largest humanitarian crises at the time, and international humanitarian groups related to the UN or private international NGOs worried, justifiably so, that the terrorist designation by the Houthis would make it really difficult for them to deliver humanitarian goods in Houthi-controlled areas. This is like a long problem that we've seen prop up in humanitarian crises around the world, where if one of the entities, one of the combatants, is designated as a foreign terrorist organization, it makes it really, really difficult for humanitarian groups to reach the civilian population under the control of that terrorist group. And so Yemen was already teetering on the brink of famine. Humanitarian groups asked the Biden administration to delist them. They were delisted. But now here we are once again talking about listing the Houthis as a terrorist organization. Like, what's your take on this debate, and where do you see this headed?
So in recent months, this administration did designate the Houthis as what's called a specially designated terrorist group this past January, which, as I understand it, is maybe hopefully a bit less restrictive in terms of the potential effects on humanitarian aid than an FTO designation. And they have also tried to use more targeted sanctions on international financial networks that are reportedly supporting the Houthis by sanctioning people and organizations that are part of that have helped to finance Houthi operations. And they've sanctioned individual Houthi leaders as well. I think beyond those really critical humanitarian implications for an FTO designation, it's hard to imagine how that would deter the Houthis or to help make the situation better, or really go beyond just kind of serving as a gesture, to say, oh, we're really serious about this time. But the Houthis have already demonstrated that they're not really deterred by this kind of thing. They can weaponize these narratives to portray themselves at home and in the region as under attack by the West, these imperial attacks from their perspective. I don't see a pathway to how that designation might make the situation better.
So lastly, the situation is extremely volatile. Are there any events or moments in the near future that you'll be looking towards that might suggest how this situation will play out in the coming weeks? I take it, obviously, like a Gaza ceasefire is a big potential inflection point hanging as like a potential future. If there's no ceasefire and things continue as they are, how do you suspect this situation will continue to evolve?
I think the recent cycle of escalation and direct strikes between the Houthis and Israel is an important situation to watch. It's worrisome and could continue to escalate, potentially in unpredictable ways, just because it is so unprecedented for the Houthis and Israel to be directly engaged with each other in this way. In general, I think, especially in the past couple of months, we've seen the Houthis ramp up their attacks on the Red Sea a bit as well, in terms of the numbers of attacks, at least. So whether that continues is, I think, an important and open question. Beyond that, I think the situation in Gaza is really critical to all of this regional escalation or potential escalation, and is important to keep an eye on as well.
Well, Alex, thank you so much for your time. This was great.
Thanks. It was my pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.